All right, everybody, welcome back to another deep dive. You ready to jump in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so today we are talking about presidential pardons. Specifically, we've got a whole stack of news articles about Biden's pardons that he issued at the end of his term. And we're going to kind of figure out what's going on there.
Yeah, should be pretty interesting.
Yeah, so to set the stage a little bit,
Mhm.
I think most people know that presidents can issue pardons, right? It's a pretty common thing. You see it happen at the end of almost every presidency. But what's unusual about this case is the sheer scope of the pardons that Biden issued. He granted more clemency than any other president in history. We're talking thousands of pardons and commutations.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, too, because he did a lot of these preemptively. So, like, people that hadn't even been charged with the crime yet, he issued these pardons and commutations to protect them from potential prosecution by the incoming Trump administration. So,
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and we'll definitely dig into that more. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's start with some of the specific cases that have been making headlines. And I think the most obvious one to start with is Hunter Biden, right? The president's own son received a pardon, and not just for like a minor offense or something. This pardon covered potential crimes committed over an 11-year period. So
yeah, that's pretty unprecedented. We've never really seen anything quite like that before. And keep in mind, this is all happening while Hunter Biden was already under investigation for his business dealings with Burisma Holdings in Ukraine. There were allegations of tax evasion, illegal lobbying, pretty serious stuff.
So it sounds like Biden might have been trying to shield his son from any potential legal fallout from those investigations.
Potentially, yeah. And it raises some questions about, a president's power to intervene in ongoing investigations, particularly when it involves family members.
Yeah, it definitely blurs the lines a little bit. And speaking of blurred lines, we can't forget about James Biden, the president's brother. He also got a pardon. And his business dealings were even more tangled than Hunter's, with allegations of influence peddling and questionable financial transactions going back years.
Yeah, there were some pretty wild stories circulating about James Biden, like boasting about investors lining up with 747s filled with cash just to get a meeting with his brother, the president. It's the kind of stuff that makes you wonder if these pardons were more about protecting family than upholding justice.
747s filled with cash. That's a bold claim, I gotta say. But seriously, with allegations like that, you have to wonder what the motivations were behind these pardons.
Yeah, and remember, congressional Republicans were already looking into some of James Biden's business dealings pretty closely. They were focusing on things like the AmeriCorps situation, where he was involved with a company seeking investments from the Middle East. And there were also those financial transfers between James and Joe Biden totaling around $240,000. The legitimacy of those transactions was being questioned.
Wait, so there was actually money changing hands between them?
Yeah.
Okay. That adds a whole other layer of complexity to this. It's like we're uncovering this whole web of potential wrongdoing.
Yeah, and to make things even more intriguing, the FBI actually wiretapped James Biden back in 2007 during a bribery investigation. So, his business activities were already on the radar of law enforcement.
Hold on, wiretapped by the FBI. Are we talking about the president's brother here? This is getting pretty wild.
It is, and it begs the question, what did President Biden know about his brother's activities? And if he knew, did it influence his decision to issue this pardon?
Yeah, that's a huge question. And it's not just limited to family members either. Biden pardoned a number of people who hadn't even been charged with any crimes yet, like Dr. Fauci and General Milley. So
right. Those were some of the most controversial preemptive pardons. Biden's reasoning was that he wanted to protect these individuals from what he saw as potential politically motivated prosecutions by the incoming Trump administration. He basically didn't trust the incoming administration to be fair and impartial.
So it sounds like he was trying to get ahead of the game, anticipating a wave of investigations and prosecutions that might come from a new administration with a very different political agenda.
Exactly, and that's a really important point. These pardons weren't happening in a vacuum. They were taking place against this backdrop of a deeply divided nation and this supercharged political climate.
All right, so we've got these family pardons that are raising some eyebrows, and these preemptive pardons that are setting off alarm bells about potential abuse of power. But there's another piece of this puzzle that we haven't even touched on yet.
You're absolutely right. We need to talk about the huge number of nonviolent drug offenders who received commutations from Biden. This was a significant part of his clemency actions, and it speaks to a broader effort to address criminal justice reform.
Okay, so let's dive into you mentioned thousands of people had their sentences commuted. What was the focus there?
Biden specifically targeted those convicted of offenses related to crack cocaine,
Uh-huh.
where sentencing disparities have historically been really bad and disproportionately impacted communities of color. He commuted the sentences of nearly 2,500 individuals, which is a massive undertaking.
So it seems like he was trying to right some historical wrongs, acknowledging the devastating impact of the war on drugs and the need for more equitable sentencing practices.
Absolutely. But there's also a layer of irony here. Remember, Biden was one of the architects of those tough on crime policies back in the 1980s. He was a strong supporter of the very laws that he's now trying to undo.
Wait, really? He was one of the people who helped create the system that led to these mass incarcerations? That's pretty wild.
Yeah, it is. And it's a point that his critics haven't let him forget. They argue that his sudden about-face on criminal justice reform is politically expedient and lacks genuine commitment to lasting change.
So are you saying that these commutations, while impactful for the individuals involved, might be more about Biden trying to reshape his legacy than about genuine systemic change?
It's a question worth considering, and it highlights this complex interplay of politics, policy, and personal redemption that's woven into these clemency actions.
Okay, so we've got these three major threads running through Biden's pardon frenzy: the family pardons, the preemptive pardons, and these mass commutations for drug offenses. And each one raises its own set of questions about the limits of presidential power, the role of personal connections, and the pursuit of justice versus political maneuvering.
Exactly. And it all comes together to paint this really fascinating and complex picture of a president grappling with legacy justice and the potential consequences of wielding this immense power.
You know, it's almost like we're peeling back the layers of an onion here, right? With each pardon revealing a new twist or like a deeper question. But what really gets me is the fact that these pardons weren't just like acts of mercy after the fact. Some of them were preemptive, like trying to head off legal trouble before it even happened. That feels like a whole different ballgame to me.
Yeah, it is traditionally pardons have been seen as like a way to offer a second chance after someone has like gone through the judicial process, served their time, shown remorse. But these preemptive pardons are more like saying, we're not even going to let the legal system play out. We're just going to step in and prevent any potential consequences.
Yeah, that's what makes those pardons for Fauci and Milley so tricky. Biden was essentially saying, I don't trust the incoming administration to handle these cases fairly, so I'm just going to take them off the table completely.
And that raises concerns about, potential abuse. Like, could a president use this power to shield allies from legitimate investigations, even if there's strong evidence of wrongdoing? It creates this slippery slope.
It's almost like saying that the president is above the law, or at least have the power to decide who the law applies to.
Right, and that's dangerous precedent to set. It undermines the principle of equal justice under the law and could erode public trust in the whole legal system.
Imagine if a future president used this power to pardon their cronies who are involved in some kind of massive corruption scandal.
Oh,
Scary thought.
exactly, and it's why some legal scholars are calling for reforms to the pardon process. Maybe there should be more transparency or clearer guidelines about when preemptive pardons are appropriate.
That makes sense. You can't just have this incredibly powerful tool with no rules or oversight. It's too risky.
But even with reforms, it ultimately comes down to the character and judgment of the president. And that's what makes these Biden pardons so fascinating to analyze. They offer a glimpse into his thinking, his priorities, his understanding of the power he wielded.
It's like we're trying to read between the lines, right? And figure out what his motivations really were. Was it about justice, loyalty, political strategy, or some mix of all three?
And that's where those mass commutations for drug offenders come back into play. It's hard to argue that those weren't motivated by a desire to address a real injustice.
Yeah, the fact that he specifically focused on those convicted of crack cocaine offenses, where we know there were huge racial disparities in sentencing, it shows that he was trying to right some historical wrongs.
But even there, his critics point out the irony of him trying to undo a system that he himself helped create. Remember, he was a key figure in the push for those tough on crime policies back in the 80s.
So it's like he's trying to make amends for his past actions, but some people see it as a case of too little too late.
It's a complex legacy, no doubt, and it raises questions about the evolution of political thinking. The ability to learn from past mistakes and the challenge of balancing personal redemption with the pursuit of broader societal change.
It also makes you wonder if this kind of large-scale clemency is really the best way to address these systemic issues. I mean, 2,500 commutations is a huge number, but it's still just a drop in the bucket compared to the overall problem of mass incarceration.
Right, it's a Band-Aid solution in a lot of ways. It addresses the symptoms, but not the underlying cause. What we really need is comprehensive criminal justice reform that tackles the root causes of these disparities and creates a more just and equitable system.
So these commutations are important, but they're just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the bigger question of presidential power and its limits. Biden's actions have shown us just how much power a president has to shape the legal landscape, even in the waning days of their term.
And it's a power that can be used for good or for ill. We've seen both sides of that coin in these pardons.
It's a reminder that we need to be vigilant, engaged citizens, holding our leaders accountable and ensuring that the power they wield is used responsibly and ethically.
But here's what really gets me thinking. All these pardons and commutations, they're not happening in a vacuum. They're happening against the backdrop of this crazy, polarized political climate we're living in.
Yeah, you're right. Context is everything. And in this case, the context is incredibly charged.
Yeah.
You have a deeply divided nation, a new administration coming in with a completely different agenda, and a sense that the stakes couldn't be higher.
It's like Biden was trying to make a statement not just about individual cases, but about the very nature of justice and accountability in our democracy.
And that statement is open to interpretation. Some see it as a courageous act of defiance, a way to protect those he felt were unfairly targeted. Others see it as a dangerous overreach, a subversion of the legal process for political gain.
It's almost like he was trying to send a message to the incoming administration, a warning shot across the bow.
Perhaps, but regardless of his intentions, his actions have undoubtedly sparked a debate that will continue to rage long after he's left office.
And that debate is about more than just pardons. It's about the fundamental principles of our democracy, the balance of power, and the very definition of justice.
It's about who we are as a nation and what we value, and ultimately it's a debate that we all have a stake in.
That's a lot to process. I think we need a moment to let all this sink in.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack, and it raises questions that we need to grapple with, not just as observers, but as active participants in our democracy.
So we've talked a lot about the specific pardons and commutations that Biden issued, but it's got me thinking about the bigger picture. What are the actual rules when it comes to presidential pardons?
Well, the Constitution gives the president a lot of power when it comes to pardons.
Like how much power are we talking?
There are a few limitations, like they can only pardon federal offenses, not state crimes. But other than that, they have a lot of leeway.
So theoretically, a president could just pardon anyone for anything.
Yeah, pretty much. And that's why this whole Biden situation has caused so much debate among legal scholars. Some argue that this broad pardon power is essential. It acts as a check on the judicial system.
Okay, so if someone was wrongly convicted or the punishment was too harsh, the president can step in and fix it.
Right, exactly. Or maybe circumstances have changed since the person was convicted. The pardon power allows for flexibility and compassion.
But then there's the other side of the coin, right? The folks who are worried that Biden pushed things too far.
Yeah, they're concerned about the lack of transparency in the pardon process. How does a president even decide who deserves a pardon? And what about the potential for corruption, especially with pardons going to family or political allies?
Yeah, it starts to look less like justice and more like favors.
Exactly, and that erodes public trust. If people think the legal system is rigged, it undermines the whole idea of equal justice.
So where do we even go from here? Is there any way to prevent this from happening again?
Well, some legal experts are calling for reforms like more transparency in the process or clearer guidelines for when preemptive pardons are appropriate. Others think the best safeguard is a strong system of checks and balances.
Yeah.
Congress holding the president accountable and an independent judiciary.
I guess it also comes down to us, right? We have to pay attention to who we elect and what they're doing.
Absolutely. The pardon power is a powerful tool, and it's up to all of us to make sure it's used responsibly.
Thinking back to where we started this whole deep dive, it's amazing how much we've covered. We went from headlines about Biden's pardons to talking about the very foundation of our legal system.
It shows how these events can connect to much bigger questions about power and justice.
And honestly, it's left me with more questions than answers, like how do we balance a strong executive with preventing abuse of power? What role should personal loyalty play in a president's decisions? And how do we make a more just legal system for everyone?
Those are great questions, ones that everyone listening should think about as they learn more about this topic.
So there you have it, folks. Our deep dive into presidential pardons. It's been a wild ride with family drama, political intrigue, and huge questions about our democracy.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.